15th of August 2016, and our speaker tonight is John McLennan, and he's going to be talking about murder in Maylands. And over to you, John.
Thank you. Okay. Are we alive? That says it's alive. Good. Okay. Maylands is a nice, quiet, residential suburb. Always has been. Well, most of the time. I'll start the story right from the beginning. Benjamin John Dunstan, was born in Sawyers Valley on the 6th of June 1894. His family moved to 102 Townshend Street in Subiaco. His parents were Caleb and Margaret Dunstan. He had an older sister called Olive and an older brother, Stanhope Caleb Dunstan. Going to school in Subiaco, he became an electrician's assistant, but as with so many young men, his career was interrupted by events on the other side of the world. Forward. There we go. He joined the 11th Battalion on the 2nd of August 1915 as number 3317, and he sailed for France. Arriving in France in March 1916, he had an apparently quiet first 6 months until in September he had a contretemps, note the French reference, with authority. And next. Yeah. Creating a disturbance and refusing to obey a lawful command of a superior officer. He was given 14 days field detention. He spent much of the next 2 years in and out of hospital with some time on duty. From later reports, he was, in separate incidents, blown up by a shell and gassed. The war ended on the 11th of November 1918, but many Australians were to spend many months more in Europe. Some coped with the delay in returning home better than others. Early in 1919, there was an entry in his record, crime absent from 900 fatigues on the 30th of the 12th, 1918 and the 31st of the 12th, 1918, awarded 7 days detention. Then a week later things turned very serious. On the 16th of January, a field general court-martial, the president was the major, at Havre in France, and whilst on active service striking his superior officer, Regimental Sergeant Major Green, and also drunkenness. Pleading not guilty on the first charge but guilty on the second, he was found guilty on both charges and awarded 9 months in the clink. That was reduced by about 3 months, I think. And he came back to Australia in late 1919 and seems to have resumed his job as an electrician or meter reader with the City Council. In 1921, he married Hazel Merlin Thomas, the daughter of Edward and Mary Ann Thomas, of 301 Churchill Avenue, Subiaco. And that is the happy couple there. Ben bought a war service home at 207 8th Avenue in Maylands, just a few houses up the road from where Bunnings now stands.
I installed that gate.
Hey?
I installed that gate.
The family seems to have lived there happily for some years. They had 3 children, Kingsley in 22, Olive in 24, and then in 1928 they had Benjamin. 1930 was a year of marital and personal difficulty for the couple. The events which follow have been reconstructed from evidence given in his trial the following year regarding some of the evidence from his first trial before the Married Women's Court in July 1930. And in March 1930, Mrs. Dunstan, mother of the accused, recalled an occasion in March when she called upon her daughter-in-law to remonstrate with her about her conduct. That was after the younger woman had been seen at the Esplanade and at the pictures. Hazel informed her, said Mrs. Dunstan Senior, that she was mistress of her own house and would do what she pleased. If her husband could not provide the clothes she wanted, she would get them elsewhere. Then on the 15th of June 1930, Ben's father Caleb died. That's notice there. During the Dunstan murder trial, short, grey-haired and sun-tanned Edward Charles Thomas, the father of the dead woman, said of the time Hazel had separated from Ben. During the past 3 years, their relations had been very strained. In July, the accused, the old man hardly ever referred to him as anything else, came to my place and asked could he see his wife. I refused. He then said, "Can I have the children?" I said, "You can have the children on condition that you get police permission to have them." Then he said, referring to his wife, "I can't see her, I'll get her, I'll kill her, I'll shoot her." On the 15th of July 1930, Ben was charged by his wife with having used threatening words towards her. Mrs. Dunstan will, on Friday at the Married Women's Protection Session of the Perth Police Court, charge her husband with cruelty. Mr. A. Haynes successfully applied to the Perth Police Court today for a remand until Friday in the case of his client Benjamin John Dunstan, who was charged on summons with his wife of having used threatening words towards her. The bench was occupied by Mr. Kidson. This was the first time Benjamin and Mr. Kidson had met. It was not to be the last. Edward Thomas, Hazel's father, also said in evidence that in July my daughter came to my place and remained there for one night. Then she stayed a couple of weeks with Mrs. Bills, a friend of the family, and later spent 3 or 4 weeks at Wagen. On her return, she lived with her sister, Mrs. Hall, at Bayswater for a fortnight, and then returned to her husband. During his trial for murder, Dunstan said, in September, he and his wife met in Beaufort Street, and again he forgave her. Immediately after she came back, she confessed that she was in a certain condition. Mr. Haynes, Dunstan's solicitor, asked to whom. Dunstan, she said she didn't know. Shortly after that, she asked me to send for a doctor, and I did so. The doctor said she had to go to a hospital as she had had an incomplete abortion, and she was there for a fortnight. Then, on December the 10th, Hazel's mother, Mary Ann, died. Hazel Dunstan Nee Thomas was a member of a wider family. If you look through that, you can see she's got brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles. Hazel's mother had been in hospital for some time, and Hazel had told her husband that she was visiting her mother in the evenings. In evidence, it appeared she had not been to the hospital. On the same day as his mother-in-law died, December the 10th, when Dunstan came home from work, he found a note. "Dear Ben, I'm leaving you to earn my own living. It is far better that we should part, as you will not be able to forget the past. I will not worry you as I did last time or cause you the expense. I'm in the best of health, your wife, Hazel." But she came back that night and said she had nowhere to go. The report on the later 2-day trial continues in part. On the 20th, I told my wife I wouldn't be home till after tea, but I changed my mind. When I went to open the front door, I heard my wife's voice say, "Look out, here he comes," and I heard scurrying footsteps. The door was padlocked, so I had to climb over a trellis at the side. As I did so, I saw a man running from the house towards the back gate. I got the revolver and gave chase, but had to give it up. When I came back, my wife was not there. I was very fond of my wife, the accused continued. My brain seemed to snap, and from the time I went out until I found myself standing over her, I know nothing. When I realised what had happened, I turned the revolver on myself, but it jammed. And this is Mr. Haynes. his counsel. Last time I spoke here, I was talking about, or mentioned a number of hotel licensing applications, and the chairman of the licensing board was this chap's father. On December the 14th at 11:30pm, continued Mr Haynes, Dunstan awoke to hear footsteps scurrying on the veranda. This is back in December the 14th, several days beforehand. On the Saturday of the shooting, Dunstan went back to work, telling his wife he would not be back at lunchtime. He came back, however, and saw a man run away from the house, picking up a revolver. We don't have those anymore. We don't have a spare revolver. He ran after him up the right of way, but his chest was too bad to let him follow. Remember, he'd been gassed. Returning to the house, he could not find his wife and went up to the fish shop. From that time, Dunstan's mind was a blank until he found himself standing over his wife, and realising what he had done, he turned the revolver on himself and pulled the trigger twice, but the revolver did not go off. So what happened in that blank spot in Ben Dunstan's mind? Here is what was, in 1930, the fish shop owned by Mr Attrell. He'd only bought it about a month beforehand from the previous owner. Early on Saturday afternoon, Mrs Dunstan fled from her home, pursued by her husband. She rushed into a shop at the corner of Beaufort Street and 8th Avenue and informed the occupants that her husband, armed with a revolver, was chasing her. Dunstan appeared in the doorway, and the terrified woman fled through the back door of the shop and, screaming with fright, ran towards her home. People attracted to the scene by Mrs Dunstan's cries were horrified to see her husband lift his revolver. There was an explosion and Mrs Dunstan collapsed. When she tried to stand up, Dunstan was standing off a few yards. 2 more explosions were heard. Mrs Dunstan staggered a few feet and then collapsed. Dunstan subsequently gave himself up to Sergeant Lewis of the Traffic Department, who lives in the same street, just opposite, I think at 210 he was, 210 8th Avenue. And Mrs Dunstan was taken in a motor car to the Perth Hospital, where she died soon after midnight last night without regaining consciousness. Yes. The Mirror and the Daily News of the 20th of December vied to be the first to break the news to a horrified Perth populace. And if we go again. Hang on, we've jumped one too far, that's okay. Note, I have not used the term domestic violence, as it was not used in the 1930s. Yet this is obviously a classic case. Charged with murder, sequel to wife's death, Dunstan in court. Dishevelled and unshaven, Benjamin John Dunstan, 33, a short, dark man, appeared in the Perth Police Court today, charged with the willful murder of his wife, Hazel Merlin Dunstan, 27. Dunstan was remanded for 8 days. The City Court was packed today when Dunstan was brought before Mr A.B. Kidson, again, acting PM. Dunstan, who is an employee of the City Council Electricity and Gas Department, was clad in a dark suit and wore neither collar nor tie. He presented an untidy appearance, his thick black hair being unkempt and his beard of several days' growth. He appeared ill at ease in the dock and hung his head most of the time. Mr Arthur Haynes, who appeared on his behalf, did not oppose the application of Prosecuting Sergeant Houston for a remand. Oops. Sorry, next one. Right. This, I'll let you read this for a couple of minutes and we'll have a quiet drink. So, there's no such place as Inglewood. The Mirror of the 10th of January 1931 had the definitive answer, I think. Okay, next. That was the same day the coroner's inquest was held. Mr Kidson was on the bench this time as coroner. As you can see, the headlines were quite remarkable. And the next one, we've got the fence against which Mrs Dunstan died. Or no, sorry, was shot. The little black circle at the bottom indicates where one of the bullets ricocheted. In her dying depositions, Mrs Dunstan said, "My husband came home in drink at 1 p.m. this day and threatened he would shoot me. He said I went out with other men and said he would shoot me and blow my brains out. He said I'd gone out with taxi men." My father was a taxi driver at one stage. "He shot me twice. This happened in 8th Avenue, Maylands. He fired both shots. I don't remember anymore." Detective Sergeant O'Brien told Dunstan in the lockup of his wife's death and that the charge of willful murder was being preferred against him. And he was committed for trial at the March criminal settings. Next. And a young woman admittedly killed by the accused in a manner revolting to our civilisation, etc. You can read the words there. The trial began on 3rd of March 1931 with Mr Justice Draper. Mr Kidson's not there this time. The trial carried on until the following day, and late in the afternoon the jury returned the expected verdict, but with a strong recommendation for mercy. Singled out by the evidence at his trial as Perth's most long-suffering husband, Benjamin John Dunstan, found guilty of the willful murder of his wife at Inglewood on December 20th, watched outwardly unmoved as His Honour donned the dreaded black cap and listened just as calmly as sentence of death was passed upon him. The Mirror of the 7th of March wrote, "Dunstan, with the words of the death sentence ringing in his ears, stopped on his way down to the cells to wave to his sister and friends and to ask in a whisper, 'Where's Mother?' Mrs Dunstan, who had borne up wonderfully well through the ordeal of the trial, was not in court when the willful murder verdict was given. But her daughter and other close friends broke the bad news to her outside, and she sat amongst them, tearless and numbed with shock." Next. Life for Dunstan. Benjamin John Dunstan has dodged the rope. Mr Haynes' appeal failed, but the Chief Justice, in announcing its dismissal, said he had no doubt that the jury's recommendation for mercy on the grounds of provocation, I think that in the modern day is called victim blaming, would receive the consideration it deserved. The Executive Council met on Wednesday when Dunstan was given life, which with the usual remissions means about 15 years. A tragedy like this does not just affect the two participants but also the rest of the families. The Dunstan children were split up, the oldest going to live with his widowed Dunstan grandmother, and the two younger ones went to live with Benjamin's younger brother and his wife. In 1937, events on the other side of the world were to have another effect on Benjamin's life. A king died, a king abdicated, and a king was to be crowned. On 13th of February 1937, the West Australian reported that a deputation met the Minister for Justice yesterday to enlist his sympathy towards securing the release from the Fremantle prison of James Benjamin Dunstan. The Minister was informed that Dunstan's crime was the outcome of his wife's conduct. His mother, who was in ill health, had to look after Dunstan's children, who needed a father's care. It was contended that recourse should be taken in such a case to medical and psychological help rather than punishment. Dunstan was now subdued and conscious of the terrible nature of the crime he had committed. It was felt that some clemency or pardon might be granted to prisoners at the time of the coronation. The Minister, in reply, said that it seemed that Dunstan had shot his wife in a very deliberate fashion. Life sentences could not be regarded as reformatory, seeing that they were for life. Consequently, their main objective was to act as a deterrent to others. And next, there was a general remission given, and that worked out for long-term prisoners of 26 days per year. So this effectively cut Dunstan's sentence by around 13 months. Next. In 1938, he wrote a letter to the army looking for his medals from World War I. and his address is given as 48 Farmer Street, North Perth. This was his youngest son's address. He was sent the medals, and I don't think he was actually living there at the time. By 1945-46 he had served his time and he would have been released on parole. Ancestry.com, that marvellous new computer-based website, records that he reappeared on the electoral roll in 1949. But the earliest I've found for him reappearing in the electoral rolls is in 1955, when he was listed as being in Kimberley Street, Leederville, and his occupation was shown as linesman. By then he was about 61 years old. It seems he'd gone back to his original trade. In 1968, he was shown in the Nedlands electoral roll as being at Sunset in Nedlands.